Yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about invasive plants today. And this overview gives you a sense of why invasive plants are an issue, gives you some idea of what some of the most problematic species are. So I'll kind of whiz through some of the species, just showing you pictures and giving you an idea of what some of the plants are. And I'm expecting that most of you will be familiar with some of these. You might even have them, in your own landscaping. We talk about that every time we do programs around the state, is we all have some invasive plants typically in our landscaping. And one of the things that the Ohio Invasive Plants Council has really gotten involved in the last few years is trying to give people good recommendations for alternatives. So if you decide I'm going to get rid of invasive plants in my landscaping, what would be good alternatives? And we have a new brochure out on that. We're going to have more materials on our website, try to provide a lot of resources for people to help them make good decisions. Okay, I'm going to get rid of such and such, and what do I replace it with? So we'll talk a little bit about that, and at the end we can go through the questions. And I will encourage you to look at our website. It's oipc.info, and I'll have that later too, so you can look it up. We have a lot of resources on our website, and so if you jot down things during the program, you want to get more information, I'll probably often say, if you go to our website, we have a fact sheet on that plant. So Marty's aware we have a lot of information out there. And, the last couple of years, OIPC has not been able to do a lot of our public programs. We do workshops typically and programs all over the state. I've done a number by Zoom, but really we've had to really cut back on our educational programming, which has been a bummer. So we'll talk about some of the invasive plant issues to begin with. If you look at this slide, I've got a photo of purple loosestrife with a field of purple loosestrife, which was taken many, many years ago up in Lake Erie marshes. So you used to be able to drive up to Lake Erie and see just fields and fields or wetland taken over by purple loosestrife. Don't see that so much anymore because we have that under control. But look at where some of these plants end up. And a couple pictures there on the right-hand side shows Calorie pear in front of a house. And then the house down in the lower corner there has a bunch of Japanese barberry. So I'll be showing you some of these, situations where, let's see, assuming that this will go for, there we go. Where, all you have to do is drive down your neighborhood, road and look, and you'll see lots of invasive plants planted in people's yards. It's important to recognize that the threat of invasive species is perhaps one of our most urgent economic and conservation challenges. And I like to put this quote in here because this was in a recent NASA report, and you might not think NASA pays attention to this kind of stuff, but we're spending more and more money trying to control invasive plants in many situations, whether it's for recreational opportunities or just in natural areas, whether it's plants or animals. So keep that in mind as we talk about this today, is that, this issue is impacting us in many different ways. And, I've been in this field for over 30 years, and I'm really impressed by how far we've come in terms of our awareness of invasive plants. We still have a long way to go, but a lot of people are aware of invasive plants now and are starting to recognize why native plants are so much better in landscaping in terms of our natural areas, just maintaining diversity. So some of the things I'm going to talk about today are listed here. What are invasive plants? What do they impact? We'll go through a few of the species that are invasive in Ohio, and you can reference our website if you want to know more. Some ideas about how to control them, a little bit about alternatives, why this is worth the effort, because it can be kind of a depressing journey to try and get rid of invasive plants. And I do it all over the state now, working in natural areas, nature preserves around the state. And it's a lot of work, and it can be overwhelming, but it's always worth the effort. And then to finish up just a little bit about some of the things that the Ohio Invasive Plants Council is doing. So first of all, it's important to understand what an invasive plant is versus something that's not invasive and may still be non-native. So when we look at non-native plants in Ohio, those are the ones that were documented to occur in Ohio after significant European settlement. So we had to draw a line, I guess, in the sand somewhere and say, so how do we know whether it's native or not? And 1870 is kind of what we use for significant European settlement in Ohio. So if it occurred prior to 1870 in Ohio, we consider it to be native. If it was documented after 1870, we consider it to be non-native. And that's, as you might imagine, kind of a gray area as to what's native and not native, but most botanists generally agree on what native and non-native are. Just because it's non-native doesn't mean it's invasive. So I like to use dandelion as an example of something that's non-native but non-invasive. It can be very invasive in your lawn, but we don't see it invading into natural areas and taking over the woods or taking over a prairie or any other natural areas. We don't see it taking over. So the ones that we're really focused on in terms of being invasive are those that are impacting our natural areas. So keep that in mind. You might have a weed in your landscaping that is problematic, but we don't see it invading natural areas. And so when we assess plants, and the Invasive Plants Council has an assessment team, and we evaluate plants, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, based on a whole number of criteria. We have now assessed over 80 different species, and we have found about 48 to be invasive in natural areas so far. I guarantee you that number is going to increase. We evaluate about 20 a year, and some of them turn out not to be invasive, and others turn out that they are invasive. We typically evaluate species that people bring up to us. We've been through so many now, 80 some, that we've pretty much identified all the typical common invasive plants, but we're still assessing species. So ones that are typically invasive in Ohio are ones I'm sure you're familiar with, whether it's purple loosestrife or teasel, Phragmites, the giant reed grass, garlic mustard, and there are 3 species of Asian bush honeysuckles in Ohio that I'll talk about. So those are the ones that typically are invasive in Ohio, and we find them in natural areas. How does that compare to all the plants that we have in Ohio in terms of how many are invasive versus the number that we have? We have about 3,000 plant species in Ohio. About 25% of those are non-native. So that's somewhere between 700 and 800. And less than 100, at least right now, have been documented to be invasive in natural habitat. So that's about 3% of the plants in Ohio have been documented to be invasive. They become invasive because they reproduce quickly. They're non-native, so we only focus on those species that are non-native to Ohio, and they have no natural controls. So that's how a small number of invasive plants becomes such a big problem. You might think, well, if it's only 80 to 100 plants, it can't be that bad, but they reproduce so quickly, they don't have natural controls, and they're hard to control, even with herbicide. So this is how they affect our natural areas to such a great deal. And when you think about, invasive plants, they were good plants that went bad. Most of these plants were introduced for very good reasons. So here's just a short list of some of the reasons that we purposefully, introduced plants to the United States, Ohio specifically, many very good reasons. And I think it's really important, if you're a master gardener or a member of a garden club, that many of these species that we have introduced for many good reasons, and a lot of them are for horticultural or nursery reasons, we didn't realize at the time that they were going to become a problem. So I think it's always important for us to realize that they were introduced with good intentions. We didn't know they were going to be such a problem when they got into natural areas. Now we're dealing with many horticultural plants that have become extremely invasive. And in some cases, some plants came in by accident, but in most cases, they came in for a specific reason, whether it was agriculture, soil stabilization, forage, herbal uses. For example, garlic mustard was introduced, for herbal and medicinal purposes. So keep that in mind. We did have good intentions. We didn't realize how bad it could become. And then you just start looking at people's backyards. So this was put together, this part of the program was put together to try and help people think about what plants you have in your backyard that are invasive, and then consider replacing them with good alternatives. And sometimes, over the years of talking to people in different groups, people are like, I just cannot get rid of my Japanese barberry, let's say. Maybe there's some that you just don't want to give up, but you're willing to get rid of other ones. So we understand that. And I know in my own yard, I have winter creeper, those two pictures there of the winter creeper on the ground. That's in my backyard. And that came from the landscaping that was at the house when we bought it, trying to get it out of the woods. Keep in mind that these plants that are invasive that you might have planted in your landscaping are not going to stay in your landscaping. They will go to the surrounding woods or wetlands or whatever you might have in your neighborhood and become a problem. Japanese knotweed, for example, there's at least one cultivar on the market that has pink flowers, and you can see what happens to that plant when it gets into wet areas. It just takes over. Same thing for Japanese barberry. You might not think that that's a problem, but it gets into the woods, very similar to Asian bush honeysuckle. It'll just start to take over the understory of the woods. So there's a long list. This is just a short list for this presentation, but there's a long list of plants that were introduced for landscaping purposes. You can cruise through that list, and I'm sure you'll probably know some of them, maybe even have some of them on your property that we thought were going to be good, didn't think they were going to be a problem and escape from our yards, but now they're in natural areas. And having been a natural areas manager my whole career, I see them, in our natural areas all over the state. And we spend a lot of time and money, volunteer time, trying to get rid of them now. And it's a lot of work. And that's pretty much the case around the country, that natural areas managers spend a percentage of their time to get rid of invasive. And that's been the last 20 years. So typically what happens with invasive plants is they occur in numbers initially, and then as they, depending on the conditions, if things change and they have the opportunity to really expand, all of a sudden they explode. So I've heard many people say, well, I had wood garlic mustard in my woods, and then all of a sudden it took over my whole woods. So that's typically what happens with invasives. They kind of hang out for a while until conditions are just right, explode. And if you wait until that explosion period to deal with them, you're going to have a lot of work to do. So here's a few more. Hopefully you recognize some of these: burning bush, calorie pear, privet, these barber. These are all sold in the nursery industry and very popular. Here's some more. I live in Knox County, and in Knox County, I drove around just taking pictures of invasives in people's yards. You can see Chinese silvergrass. One house I went by had calorie pear and burning bush growing together. That's in the lower right-hand corner. The other picture of the White House has a bunch of burning bush around the house. And so then when you think about, well, so what's the big deal? So what if they leave my landscaping and end up in natural areas? Again, just a list of some of the things that you might think about when you think about invasives ending up in natural areas, whether it be wildlife areas, national wildlife refuges, state parks, national parks. They take over, so they displace native plants and animals. They displace rare species. They reduce species diversity. For example, in this photograph in the lower left-hand corner is an area, what used to be a high-quality sedge meadow in one of our state nature preserves, where cattails took over, and you end up with these dense monocultures of just one species. So that's cattails in this sense. They alter the food web. They also affect some of our, human recreational activities, such as fishing or hiking or observing wildlife. They start to impact our economics, resources, and time. And then typically when that happens, that's when we start to really notice them and wonder, like, how did this happen? Where did we get so many? There's a lot of research going on at Cornell University in upstate New York. And one of the studies they did there was they were looking at American toads, which is a common amphibian, and seeing, what's the difference between populations in a purple loosestrife wetland, which is not non-native and very invasive, versus a native cattail wetland, which is would be a native wetland. And they found that in the purple loosestrife meadows or wetland areas, there was a 50% increase in mortality in the tadpoles in the purple loosestrife wetlands versus the cattail wetlands. And that's because as purple loosestrife grows, it actually releases chemicals into the wetlands, which then cause mortality and also change the aquatic small plants and animals that grow there, which affect the American tadpole. So that's what I mean when I say they alter the food web, is so all of these different species, plants and animals are connected. And here's a case where having purple loosestrife growing in a wetland causes a 50% increase in toad population. So that's pretty significant. As you probably are aware, invasive plants are impacting all habitats in Ohio. It's not just wetlands anymore. Every single habitat is impacted. We have a whole series of invasives that affect wetlands or the woodlands or the savannas. And as we said earlier, we're starting to see this affecting a lot of our recreational opportunities, such as hunting, fishing, boating, hiking, wildlife observation. And it costs natural resources managers lots of money. So that gets into taxpayer dollars in terms of managing our natural areas and wildlife areas. And just what managers have to do these days is spend a lot of time trying to control these species. So now what I'm going to do is just kind of go through some of the species. I won't spend a lot of time on any of these. I'll just show you pictures of them. Hopefully, as you look at them, you might say, oh yeah, I've seen that before. Oh, I have that in my yard, or I tried to get rid of that. I would encourage you, since we don't have time to go through these in depth, is that there is information on our website about each one of these. We have fact sheets that you can download that are PDFs, and you can print them off and use them as a reference if you like. We can also mail this material to you. Certainly, I can coordinate with Marty, and if you guys have particular brochures or fact sheets that you would like, you can let her know, and we can get them mailed out to you. So tree of heaven is one of the trees, probably the most invasive tree we have in Ohio. Looks a lot like sumac or black walnut, but it smells terrible. It has like a rancid peanut butter odor to it. So if you're not sure, you can always break off a leaf and smell it. This is typically found in a lot of urban areas. So I know people in Columbus that have it, that either it was planted or it's in their backyard and they're trying to get rid of it. So tree of heaven is the most invasive tree that we deal with in Ohio. There's a lot of different shrubs. I just wanted to mention like autumn and Russian olive, glossy buckthorn, multiflora rose. And then, as I mentioned, we have 3 Asian bush honeysuckles in Ohio: Amur, Moro, and Tartarian. And again, we have information on all of those on our website. Typically in Ohio, in the Columbus area, you see Amur honeysuckle, which that's what's in that photo there in the lower left-hand corner, is they have white flowers that turn yellow with age, and then red berries. Right now, this time of year, you can see the red berries really easily. They typically are in the understory of woodlands. We have a number of vines that are really invasive in Ohio, such as the Oriental bittersweet. We do have American bittersweet in Ohio, which is the native species. But for many years, soil and water conservation districts have sold Oriental bittersweet. Certainly nurseries have sold it. It's now out competing the native species in the wild. It's really hard to find American bittersweet. We have Japanese honeysuckle, and then of course, winter creeper, just 3 viney species I wanted to mention that are really invasive in Ohio. In terms of wildflowers or herbaceous forbs that are not woody, not viney, purple loosestrife is certainly one of those. Is now no longer allowed to be sold in the nursery industry. So if you see it for sale somewhere, you should report it to the Department of Agriculture. There's the purple loosestrife, Lythrum salicaria, which we typically see in the wild, and then winged loosestrife, Lythrum virgatum, is the one that used to be sold in the nursery industry. But as of, let's see, I'm trying to think, this might have been January of 2019 that it became illegal to sell. So we have narrowleaf cattail is an invasive, garlic mustard, common teasel, and lesser celandine, just to mention a few. And I know we have plenty of lesser celandine in floodplain areas in Columbus area. So those are all really common in the Columbus area, Central Ohio. A few others common or Canada thistle, yellow and white sweet clover. We mentioned the Japanese knotweed or Mexican bamboo. These are all really common ones. Some of them are more agricultural weeds, such as the Canada thistle, but we're now finding them in a lot of our prairie areas and oak savannas, like we have in Columbus Metro Parks, a number of oak savanna habitats. So these are all pretty prolific around the state now. A few grasses to mention is the reed canary grass and the Phragmites or giant reed grass. Both of these are wetland species, so you'll find them a lot of times in wetland areas, ditches along the side of the road. These are really prolific all around the state too, and very hard to get rid of because they have an underground rhizome system. So when you try to even use herbicide, it requires multiple applications because you have this extensive root system underground. One of the newest species that's come into Ohio, Japanese stiltgrass, is an annual, and it's been coming from the south. We've probably had it in Ohio now, at least in the southern part of the state, for the last 10 years, and it just forms quite the thicket in the understory, roadsides, really hard to get rid of. It is not a nursery plant. I'm not really sure what it originally was introduced for, but it's I would say worse than garlic mustard. Grows in very similar habitat to garlic mustard, but just forms quite, an extensive mat, sometimes grows as tall as 3 foot. And it's really hard to get rid of. We're seeing Chinese silvergrass, which is a highly used horticultural plant in landscaping, escaping from landscaping, especially in Southern Ohio, and just taking over fields, meadows, any open natural area habitat. So there are a number of different control options that you might consider using if you're thinking about getting rid of invasives. I've just mentioned these because in some cases, for example, you might not want to use herbicides. So then there's other tools in your toolbox that you can use. Some of them you can't probably use. For example, most of us are not able to control water levels, say if we have a little wetland area. Most of us are not able to do prescribed burning on our property. So the main two that we are able to use would be either manual, that could be either hand pulling, cutting, mowing, disking, some kind of manual disturbance. And then there's herbicide application, which, if you don't want to use herbicides on your property, then you're going to probably try more of the manual techniques. I will tell you, having been a public land manager for years, that if you're trying to get rid of particularly hard to control invasives or invasives in a larger area, it's really hard to be effective and control them without using herbicide. But there are many good ways of using herbicides carefully, selectively, and relatively safe to the applicator. So we generally do cut stump application, foliar application, which means applying it to leaves, basal bark, and when I worked for the Division of Wildlife, we actually did some aerial application. I'm going to go through just a few of these so you have a better idea of what might be options if you're not already doing them or you're interested in doing them. So there's hand cutting, hand pulling. Lots of times on public lands, we experiment with different methods, and we tried bulldozing, Phragmites, for example. We tried disking cattails. Both of these are examples of techniques that didn't work very well. If you try to, bulldoze or disc an area that has a very extensive root system, you might imagine all we do is cut up the roots in little pieces and spread them around. So maybe it knocks the species back and the population back for a few years, but right back. So it's always important to make sure that whatever technique you're using is actually effective. That's always really important. So you got to kind of monitor what you're doing. Did it work? Do I continue using this method or try something else? So you might, starting with the lower right-hand corner, you might do herbicide application with a backpack sprayer, for example. Pretty safe method to use, again, depending on the herbicide. You can apply a small amount of herbicide to a pretty specific area. If you're trying to apply to a large area, in the lower left-hand corner, we were trying to control a bunch of woody species in a 20-acre field that was habitat for the eastern prairie fringed orchid, which is a federally threatened plant. That would be considered high volume application. Same for the upper right hand, that's high volume application of where we actually there, we're spraying kudzu. That hose is attached to a tank on a truck. So you can apply a lot of herbicide to a specific area in a short amount of time. And you can see that guy is wearing full PPE, which is personal protective equipment. So he's making sure that he's not going to get that herbicide on himself. Basal bark application is where you're applying the herbicide just to the lower 6 inches of the stem of a woody species. So that way you're not cutting it. You just reach your backpack sprayer, the handle back in where the base of the woody species is, spray the lower 6 inches, the plant dies, and you can deal with the dead woody material at a later time. It's not the most selective method to use because, as you imagine, there might be some overspray, but it is effective, and it, depending on the species and the herbicide you're using, and avoids having to cut all the material down. So there's a bunch of different options out there. We in public land managers, we use a combination of all of these. When we're trying to get rid of woody species and we want it to be selectively done, you can see in that middle photograph, cut the stems down, low to the ground, treat them with a herbicide. Very specific herbicides to use, very selective method, and also very safe for the applicator. And you can see a couple of those photos there where people are applying the herbicide to the cut woody stems. When I worked in the Division of Wildlife, we actually had a helicopter. We did some aerial application of herbicides for invasive plants in large areas of wetlands. Again, most of us don't have that opportunity, but just so you know that some of that type of application is being done out there, and it's used in areas where you have really dense monocultures of individual species, and you want to try and knock them back for an extended period of time. We use prescribed burning in a lot of our grassland and savanna habitats. Many land managers in Ohio use that not just to encourage the prairie species, but also knock back invasives. And you have to be a certified prescribed fire manager in Ohio to conduct a prescribed fire, but we do training for that. And it's just important to know that if you see a fire on public land somewhere, that is an accepted method for managing grasslands and savannas, some wetlands, and controlling invasive plants. And then the fourth method that we had on the list in terms of control methods is what we call biological control. And that's where you use one of the methods that naturally occurs where the plant came from, in this case, Europe. Purple loosestrife is native to Europe and has over 200 different insects that feed on the plant. Some of them feed on flowers and roots and stems and leaves. And so research was done at Cornell University to see if there was one of these insects that we might use here in the United States. You can see that little beetle on the right-hand side of that photo. That's a little beetle that was introduced to Ohio's wetlands with purple loosestrife in the, I think it was 1994 is when we first started doing it in cooperation with Ohio State University, started rearing them. We now have well-established populations of this little beetle that only eats purple loosestrife. And that's why you don't see large areas of purple loosestrife up along Lake Erie, or as far as I know, nowhere in Ohio now, because this little beetle has controlled the populations of purple loosestrife. So this saves a lot of money in terms of resource management. You don't have to spray herbicides. You don't have to pull them out or cut them out, or really, if you get this beetle established, it doesn't eliminate the species, but it keeps it under control. And so you see very, very, very little of purple loosestrife where this beetle has been introduced. And as I mentioned earlier, it's really important to do monitoring. It's important to monitor what you have in a specific location, so that, remember when I mentioned you might have a little bit and then all of a sudden you have a lot. It's really important as much as possible to deal with it when you have a small population, because once it gets to a large extensive population, it's going to cost a lot more money in time, resources, volunteers, whatever you're using to get rid of it. And these are all photos of, controlling invasives on natural areas. On the lower right-hand corner, a whole pile of garlic mustard that was pulled by volunteers in one of the state nature preserves up on Lake Erie. So the Ohio Invasive Plants Council was formed in 2005. It was really started in the Division of Natural Areas and Preserves. As I said, we did a lot of educational effort in the late 1990s, formed a working group that was in place from 2001 to 2005. And that group decided that it would be most effective to develop a council, because there is no one agency in Ohio that's responsible for invasive plants. And you can see by our mission statement that a lot of what we do is about education and providing educational opportunities, providing leadership, promoting stewardship, education, research, and information exchange. So our council does not get involved in on-the-ground projects of controlling invasives, but we do a lot of educational work. We work with a lot of partners around the state, whether it's doing programming, developing brochures, signage, just trying to encourage all the private and public agencies out there that are doing invasive plant control to explain to people why this is important and what we're doing. Like so you know that sign, for example, with Hamilton County Park District, which is now Great Parks, big sign explaining why non-native plants are being removed, because a lot of people don't understand why we're out there getting rid of them. So here's just a list of some of the activities that OIPC gets involved in. Unfortunately, this year and last year, a lot of this we were not able to do, but we typically do several workshops a year with different partners around the state. We have brochures and posters and fact sheets. We have a tabletop display that we try to take around to different events. We have a really good website that's worth you looking into. Typically every spring we have an annual meeting. We had one last year in February, just before the COVID pandemic hit us. And now we will be having a virtual annual meeting coming up here on October 15th, which I will remind you of that at the end of the presentation. We have a quarterly newsletter. We give out small research grants at the end of each year to students primarily that are doing research on invasive plants. We developed this assessment process back in 2012 to evaluate species, determine if they're invasive. And every 3 years, we host a research conference where we talk about research going on in Ohio. And last one we had was in 2019. And I believe we're going to probably push that back just a little bit. I'm not sure when we're going to do the next one, given the COVID situation. Here's what our website looks like. So get a chance to go. We have a lot of different menu items, a lot of different resources there. Again, it's oipc.info. We also have a listserv that I encourage you to join. You can find information about how to join this group on our website, but we just recently changed it to a Google Groups listserv, and that's just an opportunity to, I know we have over 300 people on it right now. We advertise our activities there. We also, it's an opportunity to have questions answered, discussions. Sometimes they get to be kind of lively about what's invasive and what's not, but it's just a way for groups to stay in touch. And if you look at our website too, you'll see our evaluation or assessment protocol. You can look at that in a lot of detail if you're interested. This is when we started evaluating plants. We have a ranking system. So you can see ones that are really invasive. If they have a score of more than 45, they're considered invasive. Otherwise, they could be potentially invasive or pending further review. And if they get a really low score, then they're considered not known to be invasive at this time. So a lot of times we just don't have enough information species, and so they might come up as not invasive at this time, but the more information we get about them in Ohio, they do end up being changed to invasive. You can download this list from our website. I know you can't read it here, but it shows you all the species that have been evaluated and what their status is. You could click on the assessment and see exactly how we determined that it's invasive. And you can even look at all the references that our assessment team used to evaluate it if you're interested. In January of 2018, the Ohio Department of Agriculture, they developed a list of invasive plants, and those 38 species on that list can now be sold, propagated, or distributed in Ohio. So that was a really important effort. It wasn't started by the Invasive Plants Council, but we were happy to see it happen. We supported it, and we're continuing to recommend that ODA add more species to this list. So right now it just has 38 plants. We have already provided a list of, I believe, another 30 that we think should be added. They have an advisory committee which meets several times a year to decide which species could be added, and that's in progress. So that's also on our website if you want to see that list. A new brochure that came out a few years ago was alternatives to invasive plants, and we focused on 15 invasive plants in this brochure. This brochure is on our website too, so you could download it from our website. You can also send us a message through our website and ask us to send you copies of it. If you want to use it for your meetings or help distribute it around the state, we're happy to share it. So for each one of those 15 species, we have recommended 3 to 4 native or non-native alternative plants. We recommend these for replacements and landing, or maybe habitat restoration. Maybe you want to get rid of the invasives in the woods in your backyard, or a little wetland in your backyard, and you want to know what do I put there instead. So we worked really closely with Dawes Arboretum and the Ohio Nursery and Landscape Association in Westerville, actually developed this brochure, and we're happy to share it if you're interested. And this is just a really short show of what some of those alternatives might be. So for woody species, for example, tree of heaven, Amur honeysuckle, Moro honeysuckle, and Tartarian, we have recommendations, and you can see on this list some of the native alternatives that we say, if you get rid of these species, here are some ones that would be good replacements. And for the most part, we tried to pick alternatives or replacements that are available in the nursery industry. So that can be hard too. It's just making sure they're actually available. Some more woody invasives and some good alternatives. Again, this is in the brochure. It's on the website. Very soon, we're going to have more information on the website with more alternatives as well. So people have found this really popular. We've already are in a second printing of our brochure because it's been, really a lot of master gardeners and garden clubs and other agencies have been using it to really encourage the use of alternatives. And I think it's important because a lot of times, especially for garden clubs, if you're encouraging people to get rid of invasives, okay, I got rid of them, now what do I do? What do I replace it with? And initially, we didn't have good recommendations because we didn't really know what was on the market. So now we have good recommendations. We work with the nursery industry. We have 2 board members on the OIPC board that are, work in the industry. They help us with a lot of these recommendations. And so I think what we can recommend are species that you can find available. So again, some of these forbs and grasses like Chinese silvergrass and purple loosestrife, some good alternatives that you can replace them with. And so to wrap it up, I wanted to, just how do you think a little bit about, so why is this worth the effort? I mean, a lot of times people will get started on getting rid of invasives, get discouraged, feel, like it's a never ending project that you just can't get ahead. What we need to think about when we get involved in this, first of all, pick your battles. You're not going to get rid of all of them. You need to start with the high quality areas, get rid of your invasives there first, and then work your way to the other ones. And sometimes you just can't get them all. These are all photos from different places in the state, some of them being state nature preserves, where invasives have really taken over, and you have to decide, do we want these species to replace our native diverse vegetation? So that's what you have to think about, whether it's your backyard or even working as a volunteer with a nonprofit organization or a state agency or federal agency. Do we want to keep these species for future generations? And at least for me and most of us that work in this field or volunteer in this field, is we do want future generations to see the diversity that Ohio has to offer. Whether it's a rare plant or an unusual plant community, whether it's rare animals, it's up to us to manage these areas in such a way that we're going to restore native vegetation and keep them around and viable for future generations. What can you do to help? Here's a list of some of the things that you can get involved in. and be able to help us with this effort, whether it's spreading the word, getting out there and helping to control invasives. As we were talking about, using native non-invasive plants as alternatives on your own property. Be on the lookout for new invasives. Be really careful about transporting. Sometimes you might walk through the woods that has a woods that has garlic mustard, and then unknowingly it's on your boots and you take it to another woods and spread it there. As much as possible, you know, talking to other people, trying to discourage the use of invasive plants. And I know that can be hard, especially if it's your own family, trying to get people to, you know, just be more aware of the problems or the threats with invasive plants. And there's many ways, you know, to get involved, whether it's the Invasive Plants Council, the Ohio Natural Areas and Preserves Association, which is another group I'm involved with. We go all over the whole state, removing invasives on nature preserves and getting a lot of volunteers involved in that. So if you're interested in more information, our annual meeting is October 15th from 9 a.m. to noon. It's going to be a virtual meeting this time. Instead of being an all-day meeting like we usually do, it's just going to be 3 hours. We have 8 different speakers, including myself. We are going to be talking about some of the control efforts. We also have a kind of like a keynote speaker, Bethany Bradley, that's going to be talking about some more like national issues and climate change. And so you can go to our website at oypc.info for more information about the annual meeting, and you can register for that meeting via Zoom. And if you're interested or you want to share the information about research grant proposals with anyone that you know that might be doing research on invasive plants, they are due on December 1st, those proposals, and we will be evaluating them and usually typically make an announcement in January about which ones will be funded. So that's kind of an overview of the invasive plants issue in Ohio, what you can do to control them, how you can replace invasive plants with alternatives. And thank you very much for participating today, and I'm happy to address some questions. That is a very good question. And if you talk to folks in the nursery industry, a lot of these species that have been promoted are at least sold under the idea that they are sterile. Now, the problem with that is some of them are sterile and some of them are not. And it's a really gray area as to which ones are sterile and which ones are not. But for many of, like, for example, Japanese barberry, burning bush, a lot of these, they're cultivars of the actual species. And when they developed them, the point of it was that they would be sterile. A lot of research has been done on a number of these species to confirm that they're not completely sterile. So the problem with that is you might say, well, you know, they're 95% sterile. What about that 5% that's not sterile, right? There's still going to be a problem. But I guess the simple answer to that question is yes. There are sterile specimens out there, but you have to be really careful about what is called sterile versus what is really sterile in the natural environment, like out in natural areas. So it's worth looking into, but just be careful, because sometimes what in the nursery industry, what they say is sterile is not 100% sterile. Does that hopefully answer your question? Yes, you're very right. Yeah, and that's totally, yeah. Reproduction by seed. It can certainly, there's nothing that stops it from spreading by roots if it's a rhizomatous species. Correct. Disking is where you take a piece of equipment, you typically on the back of a tractor, and you're essentially plowing up an area. So it's used by farmers a lot to prepare farm fields, but it is often used in natural areas, like the picture I showed where they were disking up cattails. So it's a piece of equipment that essentially, plows up the ground. Yeah, it's like a tiller. Yeah, usually though it's a bigger piece of equipment that's on the back of a tractor. So it's, designed to impact larger areas than just, say your small vegetable garden. But it's, yeah, it'd be similar to this, or tilling up an area. Yeah, I wish we could say yes to that question, but it's very tough. Not really. There really aren't. There are some programs that you can put your land into For example, I think it's natural, I'm trying to think which agent, NRCS, Natural Resources Conservation Service. There are some programs where you can put your land in equipped, or trying to think the other one, where you're basically putting your land into a program for conservation, and then they will help provide money to get rid of invasive plants. But there's very limited funds out there where people, like you're a private landowner and you just want to get rid of invasive plants. Very, very limited funds for that. We get that question all the time. People write into our website and they want to know about funding to get rid of invasive plants, and there really is very limited funding for that. Almost always get that question. And so that's been a big problem over the years. As you might imagine, we have introduced species that then become a problem themselves. For example, the gypsy moth or ladybug beetles. We've introduced, species that, oh, this is going to solve the problem with this other species, and then that species becomes a problem. We have a lot of safeguards in place now. For invasive plants, there has to be at least 10 years of research done to make sure that if I'm introducing a beetle to control purple loosestrife, that it's not going to eat anything else. And so Cornell, again, has been the lead on a lot of this work, although there are other places that are doing it. And so, 10 years of research at a minimum to make sure that whatever I'm going to introduce is actually only going to control the species that I'm trying to control. So, I think in the past, we weren't so careful about that. We were in too much of a rush to try and come up with a control, but I think it's much better. I certainly know with purple loosestrife, we have not had any problem in Ohio with the beetle eating something else, but there's always a potential for that. And it's important that a lot of relevant research is done. A good question.
Agree.
Well, that's a tough one. Unfortunately, there are so many invasives that have been introduced to the home landscape. I don't know if I'd say barberry is the worst. I'd say it's up there in the top 10 for sure. Like I showed you in the beginning of the program, there's a lot, and they're out there in the landscape, whether it's burning bush, privet, calorie pear. I mean, there are quite a few. Now, barberry, yeah, I've seen this too about the tick problem, is that there is some research out there that suggests that barberry can be kind of a magnet for ticks, and especially, well, not just in landscaping, but also just in the understory of woods, that for some reason barberry seems to attract and almost harbor ticks. I've not heard about that with Amur honeysuckle, but yeah, I don't know if that's necessarily the reason. As probably many of you know, we're getting more and more tick species in Ohio. They're coming from the west, they're coming from the south, and I don't know how much information we have that they're linked to invasive plants, but the one I've read about with the most research is barberry.
Excellent, thank you. Well, Jennifer, very good job. Very good job on the visuals too. We always love that when we're talking about plants. That helps a lot.
Yep, I really appreciate the opportunity. Encourage you to go to our website. And if you need to contact us for any reason, there's a contact us button on our website, and I get all those messages. So happy to follow up. I'm glad to see that, another group is going to have a volunteer project day. That's great. Really good.
Right, to read that out loud, just in case somebody isn't looking at chat. Marty says, Friends of Alum Creek and Tributaries is holding a volunteer project day at Boyer Reserve on October 23rd. So, all right. And the tree should be beautiful by then.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Thanks to all of you for attending. And Marty, thanks for asking me.